In this screencast, I'm going to go over the processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis and what's kind of happening inside the cells. So let's start by taking a look at this big picture review again, because we want to make sure that you understand the big picture of what's going on here. There's a lot of different sort of small things that are going to be happening, but overall what we're looking at is light energy from the sun goes into the chloroplast, and through the process of photosynthesis, that light energy is going to be converted into chemical energy in the form of glucose with a byproduct of oxygen. So the energy is flowing through the system, the matter is going to be cycling around the system, then the mitochondria is going to convert the energy in the glucose into energy stored in ATP, which it can use for cellular processes. Meanwhile, the glucose is going to be broken down into the byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. Then carbon dioxide and water, again, can be used by the chloroplast, put together into glucose and byproduct of oxygen using energy from light. So we can see that the matter sort of cycles around and around while the energy flows through the system. So we're going to start with the process of cellular respiration. Our overall goal in cellular respiration, what's trying to be done, but has to be done in a lot of sort of complicated steps, is to take this glucose molecule, rip it apart into all of its individual carbons, because it has 6 carbons in it, and transfer the energy from the bonds in those carbons into ATP, specifically into sticking this last phosphate onto an ADP and storing the energy right there. So, question to consider to see if you're understanding this matter versus energy thing. Is it accurate to say the molecules in the food are turned into energy? Why or why not? Okay, so it is not accurate to say that the molecules in the food are turned into energy, because molecules are matter, that's atoms. Matter doesn't turn into energy, energy doesn't turn into matter, except for in really extreme circumstances, and certainly not within our own cells. So if we look at our overall equation for cellular respiration, we start with 6 carbons, we end up with 6 carbons. We start with 12 hydrogens, we end up with 12 hydrogens. We start with 18 oxygens, and we end up with 18 oxygens. Every atom is accounted for. The glucose, this is glucose, and oxygen, those atoms are all converted into carbon dioxide and water. So none of the matter or the atoms is getting destroyed or turned into energy. The energy is stored in the bonds in this glucose, and as the glucose is broken down, that energy is released and able to be used by the cells to produce ATP, to put ATP together. But the actual doesn't turn into energy. So if you ask, you eat however many pounds of food a year, and you probably don't gain that many pounds of weight. So what happens to that extra weight? What happens to that matter? Well, and you're like, oh, you poop it out, you're probably thinking that. And I mean, some of it you do, but a large portion of the mass of the food you eat is actually this. It's actually exhaled as carbon dioxide. So you generally will lose 1 to 2 pounds while you're sleeping, and this is without, going to the bathroom or doing anything like that. And the reason for that is you're not taking in any new matter, but you're exhaling carbon dioxide the whole time you're sleeping. So you're exhaling 1 pound or 2 of carbon dioxide as you sleep every night. So cellular respiration occurs in kind of 3 steps. Oh, and it says here aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic means using oxygen. So that's the kind of cellular respiration that animals and plants and all eukaryotes are carrying out. Oh, and I do want to point out the fact that plants do perform cellular respiration. It's not like plants do photosynthesis and animals do cellular respiration. Plants just do both because plants need ATP as well. So there is a type of respiration known as anaerobic cellular respiration, which is without oxygen. That's also known as fermentation, and it's a less efficient way of breaking down the glucose and getting energy out. It still gets some energy out, but that's something that would be performed by bacteria and certain other organisms like yeast. Okay, so back to the 3 steps. We have step 1, glycolysis. Step 2, the citric acid cycle, which is sometimes also called the Krebs cycle, and step 3, chemiosmosis, which can be broken down into 2 parts, the electron transport chain and ATP synthesis. Starting with glycolysis. So we have our glucose. Glucose is kind of a hexagon shape. It's made of 6 carbons. The glucose is broken in half during glycolysis. And these 2 halves, these 2 new 3 carbon molecules are known as pyruvate molecules. So the energy that is released as those first bonds in the glucose are broken is used to create a few ATPs. So we get some ATPs being produced here, which is, again, our overall goal. And it's used to transfer 2 energy-carrying electrons from the glucose to a carrier molecule, which is known as NAD+. So NAD+ is going to pick up some of the energy from the glucose in the form of these electrons. When it does so, it also picks up some hydrogen that was in that glucose as well, and it becomes NADH. So this first step in cellular respiration, glycolysis, is the earliest and simplest energy releasing pathway. Note that we did make some ATP. This happens outside of the mitochondria, so this just happens out in the cell cytoplasm. And so prokaryotes, like bacteria, which do not have mitochondria, they can perform glycolysis too, and they get their energy from performing glycolysis. For eukaryotes, they will sort of continue on with further steps to further break down the glucose, but for prokaryotes, this is kind of how they get their energy. So the next step is that pyruvate, that 3 carbon molecule, is further broken down. It's split down into a 2 carbon molecule, so this is carbon, 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 and this extra carbon is released as carbon dioxide, which is just, exhaled. And then these 2 carbons are called an acetyl group. They join with an enzyme called CoA to form what is known as acetyl-CoA. So that's right here. So the end result of this step, again, is that carbon dioxide is released. 2 carbon dioxides are released, because remember we had 2 pyruvate molecules that are getting broken down further. So 2 carbon dioxides exhaled. These 2 carbons each join with a CoA enzyme. And then we're able to make a little bit more NADH from the energy that was released in that bond as it was broken. So a little bit more high energy electrons are released, bonded to NAD+ to produce NADH. The next step is known as the citric acid cycle. It used to be called the Krebs cycle, but there's kind of a trend against naming things after the scientists who discover them. So now it's called the citric acid cycle. The end result of the citric acid cycle is to rip apart the bond. Remember, we've got kind of 2 carbons left, well, really 4. We've got 2 sets of 2 carbons left from our original glucose that are still bonded together. And there's a lot of energy in that last remaining bond that they're holding on to. So the purpose of the citric acid cycle is to rip those final 2 carbons apart into 2 separate carbon dioxides and harvest all of that energy from that last remaining bond. The energy from that last remaining bond is used to transfer more high energy electrons into more NADH, high energy electron carrier, and another similar molecule called FADH2, which really does the same thing as NADH. And now this process is taking place inside the mitochondria. So here's the mitochondria. It's taking place inside the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So if we look at our mitochondria, we've got the outer membrane, we've got this squiggly inner membrane, and then all the way inside both of those membranes right here in this space, that's where the citric acid cycle is happening. So the end result of the citric acid cycle is we make 4 more CO2 molecules, so the last 4 carbons from the original glucose are released. Now the glucose has fully been ripped apart, and all of the energy from that glucose has been transferred into some ATP, and these energy electron carrier molecules, NADH and FADH2. So if we're tracking the energy, it's gone from the glucose to some ATP, but mostly NADH. This is the diagram of what the actual citric acid cycle looks like. There's a lot of steps, a lot of reactions, a lot of enzymes involved. You do not need to memorize this. I was made to memorize this in college and it was terrible. So here's hoping that you never have to memorize this, but just FYI, it's pretty complicated. All right, this is a lot, so let's take a pause and see if you can explain what has happened to the glucose so far. So go back through, kind of talk through it for yourself. What's happened during glycolysis, then what happened next between glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, and then what happened during the citric acid cycle. Think like what went in, what came out, and where is the energy being stored. So the last phase of this process is known as chemiosmosis, and like I said, it consists of 2 parts. The electron transport chain, and then the actual synthesis of ATP. So if we're looking at location again, the last step we looked at was inside the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Glycolysis was out here in the cytoplasm. Now this step, chemiosmosis, takes place on proteins embedded in this inner membrane. So this is happening on proteins that are stuck in this inner squiggled membrane of the mitochondria. So the electron transport chain. So we're looking at here, see the little phospholipids. This is the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, double layer. And then the blue and the orange things, those are proteins that are embedded or stuck into that inner membrane. So what's going to happen is those NADH and the FADH plus that were created in the previous steps that are carrying all of that energy in their high energy electrons, they're going to come and drop off their electrons and also their hydrogen ions, H+, at the electron transport chain. The electrons are going to be passed from protein to protein embedded in the membrane, which is why we kind of call it a chain. So they're going to go bounce to this protein, then the next one, 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 sort of all down the line again in a chain. As they do so, they are losing some of their energy that they were storing. They're using that energy to pump the hydrogens, the protons, into the inner membrane space of the mitochondria. So they are creating a high concentration of protons. This is the inner membrane right here in this part of the mitochondria. So remember, it takes energy to pump something against its concentration gradient. That's active transport. So they're creating a high concentration of protons on this side. They're pumping them against their concentration gradient, making there be a lot of protons out here. And that is taking energy, which is the energy that was supplied by those high energy electrons that the NADH were carrying. So the electrons have to move down this chain from protein to protein. They're literally bouncing protein to next protein to next protein to next protein to next protein. When they get to the very last protein in the chain, they have to go somewhere. They can't just hang out on this protein forever. And so they are taken in by oxygen. So this, right at the end, this is where oxygen actually comes into cellular respiration. Oxygen is known as the final electron acceptor. Basically, without oxygen, the electrons would get backed up. As if there's already an electron here, a new electron can't come to the same protein that's already occupied. So the whole chain would get backed up, nothing would be able to move, cellular respiration would shut down, and you would die essentially because you couldn't make any more ATP. So this right here, this is why you need to breathe. And it's literally the only reason you need to breathe. You need oxygen because oxygen is needed to take those electrons that are done with the electron transport chain away so that the chain can continue flowing and doesn't get backed up. Okay, so let's track where we are right now. Where is the energy right now? We had the energy was in the NADH molecules. They brought it to the electron transport chain. The electrons dropped off their energy and joined up with oxygen, and that energy was used to pump H+ across the membrane. So now, at this stage, the energy is in that concentration gradient of protons. So remember, things naturally want to move from high to low concentration. So you could think of these protons as like water behind a dam. They really want to flow down there where there's less of them to even out that concentration gradient. So there's stored energy, just like stored water behind a dam. And so we get to our last step of cellular respiration, which is ATP synthesis. So there is an enzyme also embedded in the membrane called ATP synthase. And the job of ATP synthase is to turn ADP into ATP. It gets the energy for that by allowing those protons that are all backed up on that side of the membrane to flow through it, kind of like a turbine on a dam. So as those protons flow through, it takes the energy of that and puts it into producing ATP. And so this is really like, where the ATP mostly gets synthesized. We've synthesized a few ATP along the way, but this process can synthesize about 32 ATP per glucose in ideal situations. It might be a little less than that, but about 32 ATP per original glucose can be synthesized by this ATP synthase. And so finally, those H+ that flowed through the ATP synthase can join up with the oxygen and the high energy electrons to form water, which is our final product of cellular respiration. All right, so let's take a pause again. Please try now to describe, and you can look at the diagrams and work through it, what happened in the electron transport chain and what happened in the ATP synthesis step. And then this is just a diagram kind of summarizing everything that happened when different stuff went in and where it was taking place. So this might be a good time to take a pause, stretch, take a little break before we go on to photosynthesis, because I understand this is a little dense, kind of a lot, so if you need to take a break right now, you can do so and then come back to this. So photosynthesis, we're not going to go into quite as much detail in photosynthesis as we did in cellular respiration, but there are some key points you need to know. So like how in animal cells, and in plant cells actually, cellular respiration is taking place in mitochondria. In the plant cells, photosynthesis is occurring in the organelle called the chloroplast. And so here's a diagram of a chloroplast. Like the mitochondria, it has an outer membrane and some inner membranes, although the chloroplasts are shaped a little bit differently. Instead of that squiggle, they're kind of like in these little pancake stacks. And the pancake stacks are known as thylakoids. So our overall goal in photosynthesis is to convert energy in light from the sun into chemical energy stored in food, specifically sugar, specifically glucose is what's going to be produced through photosynthesis. I also want to point out the plant has multiple uses for that glucose. Some of it it's going to send to its mitochondria to make ATP. Some of it it's going to use to produce cellulose, which is just a whole bunch of glucoses chained together, which build the plant's cell walls. So it kind of actually builds the plant itself. I'm going to point out that photosynthesis first evolved in prokaryotic cells, specifically algae in the ocean. And so these algae, these very, very early forms of life that were the first photosynthesizers, are responsible for creating an oxygenated atmosphere on Earth. Before photosynthesis, there was oxygen, but it was stored in other things like in carbon dioxide, and there wasn't really much O2, oxygen gas, floating around in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis really happens in two steps. Step one, the goal of step one is capturing the light energy from the sun, and then the goal of step two is to take that energy and convert it into energy stored in sugar. So use that energy to put together water and carbon dioxide into glucose. And if we look at our equation here, you should notice that all of the inputs and outputs minus the light, all of the matter inputs and outputs are the opposite of cellular respiration. Got glucose, oxygen coming out, carbon dioxide, and water going in. So step one, the harness the light part, we call the light reactions, which makes sense. They require light to take place. During the light reactions, light is absorbed by pigment molecules in the plant. For example, chlorophyll is one of the best known pigment molecules. It's green. There are other pigment molecules out there that can absorb light as well, but a lot of times we'll see the chlorophyll and the plant will be green. During this process, water is split releasing oxygen. And so this is important for the question, where does the oxygen produced by plants come from? Because a lot of people think, well, if we look at the equation, we've got water and carbon dioxide going in, glucose and oxygen coming out, and a lot of people will assume, oh, probably the carbon dioxide gets converted into oxygen, right? And then oxygen gets converted into carbon dioxide, back and forth. However, that is actually not the case. The oxygen that is produced by photosynthesis is actually from the water that the plant takes in, not the carbon dioxide. The oxygens and the carbon dioxide all actually go into producing the glucose. And so for whatever reason, this is something that gets asked about sometimes, where the oxygen produced by plants in photosynthesis comes from. The oxygen produced by plants in photosynthesis comes from water, not from carbon dioxide. Okay, so water is split during this process. The high energy electrons and the hydrogens, the other part of water, are transferred to carrier molecules, similar to how the high energy electrons from glucose were transferred to carrier molecules in cellular respiration. In this case, the carrier molecule is called NADP instead of just NAD, but it really does the same thing. It's a carrier molecule for high energy electrons and hydrogens. There's also a little electron transport chain that happens, kind of similar to cellular respiration, which produces a little bit of ATP as well. This is a diagram of what's actually happening. As you can see, it's quite complicated, and I don't really think it's worth our time to go into all of the steps right now, but feel free to look that up if you're interested. Right, step 2, the Calvin cycle. So at this point, during the light reactions, we gathered some energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, specifically the high energy electrons being carried by the NADPH. The energy from light essentially was converted into this energy. Now we're going to bring in the carbon dioxide and combine the carbon dioxide with these hydrogens using this energy to create glucose, which is our end goal. So this is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. You could think of the light reactions as the photo part. Photo means light, and synthesis, building. So this is the part where glucose is actually built. It doesn't have to be light for this part to happen. The plant can kind of store up this stuff and carbon dioxide and continue producing glucose after dark until it, runs out of these things. But also it doesn't have to be dark, so it's not really accurate to call these the dark reactions. These are still going to be taking place while it's light as well. And then this diagram just summarizes everything I just said of what is happening during the Calvin cycle. All right, so that is going to be the end of our photosynthesis and cellular respiration overview. Please feel free to watch this one again. This one might be one you need to watch again.